Hi, this is Sheb Varghese. Welcome to the Faith Colloquium podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr. Corwin Smidt. Dr. Smidt earned his PhD from the University of Iowa, along with Dr. Thomas Heilke, who did his PhD at Duke University. And today we're talking about the church and politics. Thank you so much for participating in this discussion. The question I'd like to ask both of you, but I'll start with you, Dr. Smidt, is how you became interested in the topic of religion and politics.
Well, it started when I was a young faculty member at Calvin College at the time. And what had happened was when I went to graduate school during the late 70s, there really was very little emphasis on religion and politics, partly because the prevailing theoretical frameworks at the time, secularization, as well as sort of the Marxist interpretation of politics, in which religion was really nothing but an epiphenomenon of sort of economic concerns. Both of those frameworks sort of indicated that religion was unimportant and not worthy of the attention of political scientists in terms of trying to explain political phenomena. But with the election with Jimmy Carter and then the election of Ronald Reagan, political scientists began to look more closely at religion. And what was happening is that a fair number of people who were trying to study the role of religion in politics were relatively unfamiliar with religion in the United States and its tremendous diversity. And so I began to see studies in which people were labeled fundamentalist Christians when they attended very liberal denominational churches. For example, the United Church of Christ in one study I remember was labeled a fundamentalist denomination, even though it's been a very strong mainline denomination for a number of years. And so I thought I had something to contribute, given my interest in religion. I grew up as a pastor's son. I had gone to seminary for a year as well. And I thought, well, at least I have something potentially to contribute in this area because of some of my background information. So I became involved in the study of religion and politics and never left it, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for sharing. Dr. Heilke, how did you get interested in the topic of religion and politics?
I guess my answer would be probably a fair bit more autobiographical in some ways than the story that Corwin just told us. I grew up in an immigrant family in the 1960s and 70s in Western Canada. One of the stories that I remember one of the comments I remember from my father at the dinner table was this was in the late 1960s, early 70s, when there were a number of famines in Africa. And, it was before the days of the internet, of course. All the news was by radio and TV and newspaper. And a lot of my friends would, their parents would make a comment like, eat your dinner, children in Africa are starving. And my dad in particular would make the comment, eat your dinner. When I was your age, I was starving. Both of my parents were refugees from Prussia and Poland and grew up as children during the war and were refugees after the war. So a larger part of sort of conversations about the family were stories about wartime trauma and hardships, mostly as civilians during the Nazi era and during the Soviet occupation. And so I kind of grew up with those stories. My grandfather on my dad's side was actually a member of the German underground, a member of the Confessing Church, and of course all kinds of stories associated with that. One of my uncles, one of his sons-in-law, was a member or became a member of the Nazi Party during the war. My other grandfather became a member of the Nazi Party after the invasion of Poland, which is where they lived. But my mother was a serious-minded, a lifelong practicing Lutheran, and my father was Lutheran as well. So I grew up in a fairly conservative Lutheran household. But dinnertime conversations that I remember as a teenager were sometimes around questions like why German Lutherans would obey Nazi orders, the relationship between faith and political authority. I remember my father at one point giving me a fairly sort of Lutheran, what I call now a Lutheran Kantian answer about obedience to authority, which I saw even as a teenager as being deeply problematic. And I know my dad was always a little bit ambiguous about that question because on the one hand, he was fairly conservative conservative, but on the other hand, he had a pretty strong sort of anti-authority and certainly anti-obnoxious authority trend. So those were discussions around the dinner table. Discussions about surviving Soviet atrocities during during the occupation among the German civilian population, discussions about what the Germans had done before that. I read Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago in 9th grade, and my mother was an avid reader of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, so I read a fair bit of his work already by the time I was out of high school. Other folks that I read were people like C.S. Lewis, of course, and Francis Schaeffer and others. So by the time I went to university, I knew I wanted to be a major in political science. And unlike Corwin's experience in what we would call mainstream political science, I was interested in political theory. And there, of course, religion had never really left as a question. If you read the political theory of the West in particular, religion is pretty much front and center almost always in some regard. And because I was interested in political philosophy and because the question of religion, or I think more broadly and maybe more fairly the question of the gods, is never far away from the center, even in 20th century political thought, thinking about those kinds of questions was not some kind of a move that one had to make. It was just right there and right at the very surface of what you were studying. So I guess I would say that it's always been a question for me. So that's sort of the medium length version.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Dr. Smidt, I know you've written about religion and politics. Could you please explain your approach to the relationship between the church and political institutions? Could you just share a little bit about your take on that?
Well, I'm really more of a social scientist in the sense that I study surveys. And so a lot of what my approach is more what might be labeled empirical in nature, trying to examine just what Americans may think about church, about how they relate to religious life, how their attitudes towards religion in public life. So that's the kind of work that I do. Although certainly the whole issue of how the church and state should relate, the more constitutional and philosophical issues are important as well. And I have written in that general area, but that's not really the focus of my most of my research and work. So I tend to be a little, Tom and I both have interests in religion and politics. We appreciate each other's work, but we work in different streams, I guess you could say, in terms of how we approach this topic.
Okay. In terms of the sort of philosophical question about the relationship between church and state, do you mind just fleshing out briefly your views on that?
Yeah, broadly speaking, I'm from the Reformed tradition, which sees a role for a church and a role for the state, that they're not closely bound together, but each has a function to perform. Basically, the Reformed perspective suggests that there are different groups in society, and each have a legitimate place in society, that we need to recognize this diversity and appreciate each other's perspective, that really the state is not there to impose a religious faith upon the people, but that the church, that's the function of the church and not the state. So there's within the Christian tradition, there are different approaches to how the church and state should relate to each other. And my approach is more from what might be broadly labeled a Reformed perspective.
Okay, that's helpful. Dr. Heilke, could you please explain your views on the relationship between the church and the state?
Sure, and in sort of very summary fashion, I guess I've probably known since an early age, again looking back on my growing up in the Lutheran tradition, that in some important sense the church is a manifestation of God's politics, and there is in some sense a coordination between the church and what I would more broadly call political authority, at the same time that there is an opposition between the two. And I would say that even the writings of people like Francis Schaeffer and C.S. Lewis and other people in that sort of class of writings made pretty good sense to me out of that perspective of the church being God's community in the world and being something more than where we go to get saved in sort of an individualistic, I'm going to be going to heaven someday kind of a sense. I think I had a pretty strong sense from early on that there was a kind of the church is a community which stands over against, but hopefully also when things are going well, in collaboration with political authority. And obviously that general sensibility then at some point eventually turned into an affirmation of general Anabaptist sensibilities. And again, I do remember growing up, and the Anabaptists among the conservative Lutherans that I grew up with were kind of anathema. But at some point, I guess you can say I sort of became a convert. That's a whole nother long story. But also, I think it's been helpful speaking with many of my friends in other faith traditions like Corwin, also becoming increasingly aware of certain of the shortcomings of the Anabaptist community vision, which includes problems with patriarchy. There's a pretty oppressive side to some of the Anabaptist communities. All the same, all that said, there is a kind of a sense, in my mind at least, that the church in a certain sense is God's politics. At the same time, I'm a political scientist in a secular institution. I teach mostly political theory. I regularly assign writers like Thucydides, Machiavelli, Hobbes, and others. And that's sort of another piece. And I've always been curious about what Corwin and some of his colleagues make of this claim that, and there would be empirical, there would be some empirical findings to be associated with this claim, that politics really, at the time of the Reformation, becomes, according to thinkers like Sheldon Wolin, becomes kind of a game for amateurs. Sheldon Wolin and Hannah Arendt makes a sort of a similar argument, makes the argument that with Machiavelli and perhaps Hobbes, we have the last serious claims that politics needs to be understood as a professional activity, or an activity of professionals, and I want to be careful how I use that word, and that in the Reformation it becomes more an activity of amateurs. And of course, there's been a lot of arguments about the naivety of certain religious traditions with regard to politics. And one of my questions would be, what does the word calling mean, both in the Reformed and in the Lutheran tradition, which I grew up in, if it doesn't mean a certain level of professionalism, a certain level of knowledge, a certain kind of an expertise. And in the Protestant tradition, to some extent, and this is true of the Anabaptists certainly as much as it is of Reformed and Lutheran and other traditions, there's sort of an exemption of politics from that particular requirement of one actually needing to know something, of there being a certain expertise involved. And of course, that's a dangerous statement to make in a context of democratic politics, because there where all citizens, which also means all Christian citizens, can vote. What kind of a claim are you making then when you say that there also ought to be a certain level of professional knowledge, a certain level of expertise involved in the doing, as it were, of politics?
Well, I mean, I think what Tom just said is very interesting, and I'm not certain just how I would respond to that. I think to a certain extent, obviously, when we talk about the priesthood of all believers that is associated with the Reformation, it tends to have that democratizing type of influence in other areas as well, which probably relates to politics in a way. And certainly, I think you could make an argument that the calling of politics may be more related to the office holders, but as opposed to voters. But these are just some initial quick responses to what he said. I would like to, if this isn't too personal, I'd like to hear a little bit about Tom's background with regard to the confessing church during the his relatives' association with the confessing church during the Nazi era. I too have been fascinated with Dietrich Bonhoeffer and think there may be some parallels between his time and our time in the United States, at least, and would just sort of be interested in hearing what experience or what he has heard from his relatives related to that period of time.
My dad's older siblings would tell, the stories they would tell would be that already in the early 1930s, people like my grandfather were well aware of what the Nazis were doing with respect to building concentration camps and so on. Those didn't start with the final solution at the Wannsee Conference in 1942. They started already in the early 1930s as the Nazis came to power and were building concentration camps in which they then would incarcerate political prisoners and other Germans. Anyway, so that was information that was already available if you were looking for it. And my dad's older siblings recount stories of my grandfather just being in absolute, I don't know what the right word, perplexity would be much too soft a word, at what was going on. And one of the comments that they recount him making at I don't know if at the dinner table or in what kind of a meeting was, if we continue in this way, they will never allow us back into the Commonwealth of Nations. And so my grandfather at least and people like him knew of the kinds of abuses and crimes that the National Socialists were committing already early on in the regime. One of the social and political consequences of being a member of the confessing church was what the Nazis referred to as Sippenhaft, which meant the possibility that your entire family could be arrested and sent to the camps for your participation in the underground church, in the confessing church. And so that, again, formed a little bit of the background to the kinds of stories that my family would tell about about wartime and about the Nazi regime before that. And part of what is perplexing as far as making sense of how to even think about this is at the same time that my grandfather is a member of this resistance, as it were, and very much a Christian resistance. Of course, his oldest son is drafted into the military, serves on the Russian front, spends either 2 or 3 years in a Russian POW camp before he is sent home, which actually happened to a minority of Germans. Most of the German POWs in Russia never came home. So you've got that. You've got a son-in-law who decides to become a member of the party. So you've got a story of a great deal of intra-family conflict and a great deal of ambiguity, ambivalence are not the right words, but perhaps tension between various aspects of your duty as a German citizen, your duty, your moral obligations as a Christian. And so that really formed many of the conversations, not only around the dinner table, but then also with some of my dad's siblings, who all of whom, or most of whom at one point or another, came for visits to where we lived from Germany. So most of my relatives actually are still in Germany. So those, that's sort of a little bit of the background that for me at least shaped, I think, the kinds of questions I was interested in, the kinds of political concerns I was interested in. So I was not so much a political scientist as Corwin is, who, by the way, is a very good empirical political scientist. But I was more interested in some of these theoretical questions. And as I think we know, the vast majority of especially of German Lutherans sided with the National Socialists in the sense that they subordinate the church to the National Socialist agenda in what was known as the German Christians. And that then became a major aspect of German political theology among people like Helmut Heilke after the war. So there's a whole another history there to be told about the history of especially of Lutheran Christianity, but to some degree also Catholic Christianity and the National Socialist regime.
Yeah, when the church gets too tied with the political order, obviously, important repercussions can flow from that. And so there are, issues within American Christianity today as we're divided as to whether or not just how to stand in relationship to, those who are currently in political power. And Christians are divided, much like the German Christians were. There are some who believe that supporting what we need to do is support the current administration because they're protecting Christians, and others say no, that this is the way in which we go about doing this is unjust and divisive and not showing love for your neighbor. And so Christians themselves are on different sides of the political divide because of it.
Yeah.
Right. Dr. Heilke, did you have questions you wanted to ask Dr. Smidt about his take on politics in the church?
Well, let me start with this. I went back and read through the pretty big sections of that book that Amy Grant put out, in which I wrote the chapter on Anabaptist political thought. And I would start by saying I don't actually know what Corwin's views are. And what I mean by that is that, our book is entitled, what is the title exactly? The Church and Politics, or five views on the church and politics. And there are basically then five of us wrote from five different traditions. But at least four of us talk in our chapters about how within our own tradition of thinking about the church and politics, there are a number of different views. So you probably could write a book saying the church and politics in the Reformed tradition, 5 views. The church and politics in the Lutheran tradition, 5 views. I don't know what Corwin's views are, because one of the things I have learned over time that's been, I think, very worthwhile for me is I should never assume that because I know that, say, Corwin is part of the Reformed tradition, or somebody is a Lutheran, or whatever it would be, that I actually have a clear grip on what that means for how they would approach the question of the relationship between the church and political authority. So that would be my opening sort of gesture. And maybe I should leave it at that for a moment then, and I can come back to maybe a couple of questions in general from my Anabaptist perspective.
Well, Tom, you're absolutely right. I probably did not reflect on the diversity within the Reformed tradition in that chapter. And part of it is that, I'm not a political philosopher, and I'm not really one that has given a great deal of time and attention to all the diversity that's present. So to say where I am in relationship to differences within the tradition, I would be hard pressed to even know which segment of the tradition I would most closely adhere to. I would say that, even in terms of the Reformed tradition, I think it probably is more something that is infused within me by growing up within the tradition than something that I, carefully articulate and think about, a type of thing. So, I really couldn't answer your question directly, I guess I would have to say. And that's partly because of my own lack of information, I would say.
Could I ask a question here?
Sure.
So could one of you or both of you so these terms like the Reformed kind of perspective and then the Anabaptist, can one of you or both of you just kind of give us general explanations of what those might be? Like, is there overlap between those two? Are they really starkly different? Yeah, I'm just wondering if someone could comment about that.
Tom may be in a better position. If I'll just say some general comments here, and these are going to be broader comments. The Anabaptist tradition is much more of a pacifist tradition than the Reformed tradition. That doesn't mean that all Anabaptists are necessarily pacifists, but as a group, they're much more in that tradition. The Anabaptists tend to see the state more as from my perspective and understanding, more as a problem or what shall I say, a potential enemy than what the Reformed tradition would see. The Reformed tradition sees a rightful function for the state, but also a different function for the church. And those would be very broad comments. So to let Tom, who's the philosopher, let him clarify those things.
In general terms, I probably wouldn't disagree with a word that Corwin has said about that. Obviously, and this might not just be because of my philosophical background and inclinations, but for other reasons too. I'd want to nuance a little bit of what he said, but no, basically, I think that's right. I would say that some of that again comes in part out of just the historical experience of the Anabaptists having been severely persecuted and many Anabaptists like to joke in a grim sort of way that one of the very few things that Catholics, Lutherans, and at the time they would have called them Calvinists, Reformed Christians, could agree on in the 1500s was that Anabaptists ought to be persecuted and, if possible, wiped out. And that brings me to one of a couple of comments I would want to make about this. We can all look back at our history, and every single Christian tradition has an account of its own martyrs, and most of those martyrs were made at the hands of other Christians. And one of the things that I think is happening very clearly in the 20th and 21st century is this secularization trend, particularly in the West, so in Europe and in North America and elsewhere. One of the four aspects of secularization that scholars identify is what they call a liberalization, and that doesn't mean quite what we often think it to mean in partisan political terms. Liberalization meaning what Kenneth Wald called the lowering of barriers between religious groups and the relaxation of orthodoxy. That's his phrase. So in other words, we worry less and less about our petty differences and start to think more carefully about what we have in common. I remember when I was in graduate school, I had a friend, and I guess I won't identify what tradition he was from, but he was getting magazines in his mailbox on a regular basis from his denomination. And one day somebody put the magazine in the wrong mailbox and put it in the mailbox of another friend of mine who as far as I know, was more or less an atheist, but certainly didn't identify himself with any particular Christian tradition or denomination. And he reads through this magazine, which was about various disputes going on in this other denomination, various doctrinal questions and so on. And he said to me after he'd read it, his conclusion was, boy, these people sure don't like one another very much. So that it reminds me of an Arab prophet, an Arab saying that I'm told by some of my Arab friends exists. This Arab saying is, my cousin and I against the world, my brother and I against my cousin. And I think Christians have, I think all too often, been sort of have manifested exactly that particular proverb in the way that we have behaved. And one of the interesting movements that is occurring now among a number of different Christian groups is what is known as the Post-Christendom Model, and more precisely even a church in exile model. And there are a number of writers who've talked about this. Stanley Hauerwas and Will Willimon wrote one of the original books about 25 years ago called Resident Aliens. But there's now quite a large literature, and certainly not only within the traditions that Stanley and Will Willimon represent. In fact, I've read a couple of books now by Reformed Christians who are talking about this question about what happens if Christians are no longer in the majority. What happens if the church is no longer has any serious sociological or social authority? Then perhaps we need to look at a model that looks something more like what they call the church in exile, and they go back to certain of the prophetic books, Jeremiah and Jonah being two of them. They look back at models of being Christian and being church in contexts where the church really doesn't have the kind of political and social power it once did, particularly in the United States, but certainly also in Canada and for sure in many European circumstances. And I would argue that the Anabaptists would perhaps offer a useful resource in that particular context, since they have been on the outs socially and politically for the most part, for several centuries. That's not always been true, by the way. There are examples in Dutch history and in other places where Anabaptists did, in fact, have some social standing and, in fact, did have some political standing. But Mennonites and other Anabaptist groups probably can offer some interesting models of how to be church in that kind of a new context. So that would be just a couple of not even concerns, but just observations that I would throw out there as we consider our various traditions and our backgrounds. One of the questions is, well, what does it mean in that context to be church today? And that, again, was, I think, for me, one of the animating questions in terms of my own personal sort of faith journey, as I was thinking about my grandfather as, a member of what had really been a state church, now having to look from the outside in and think about what does it mean to be a Christian in this context where the state church has been suborned by the political authorities, and we wouldn't want to call them exactly benevolent political authorities. What does it mean for me to be a Christian in this context? And that was quite a mind warp, as it were, quite a sort of turning on its head of many of the ways he might have imagined himself being in relation to political authority during the Nazi era.
I'm wondering, sort of practically, can we imagine someone from the Reformed tradition and someone from the Anabaptist tradition voting very similarly or being motivated by the same kinds of reasons to vote the way they do? Would one not vote? How could we think about those questions?
Yeah, I think that, that there are times when I think it would depend on the particular issue at hand, the particular context in which you are voting as well. But there would be many times in which Anabaptists and people from the Reformed tradition would cast similar votes. But there would also be times, potentially, where given certain theological perspectives, one might vote differently. So, for example, if you took your pacifist views very seriously, and there were votes related to candidates who would be more aggressive, let's say, in terms of foreign policy, there may be reasons why an Anabaptist would vote against a particular candidate on those grounds, whereas a Reformed Christian might be not as hesitant to do so. But in many other contexts, you might find that they would vote similarly.
Okay.
Well, let me give you an interesting example that I just happen to know because of my association with a number of Mennonites and Amish in central Kansas when we lived in Kansas. They said that there was a huge shift among the Mennonites I think it was the first election when Richard Nixon came to office. They all voted for Nixon, and I was sort of used to a fairly socially liberal church in Lawrence, where we were all about social justice and things like that. And I said, okay, why did they do that? He said, because Nixon promised to get the United States out of the war in Vietnam, and being pacifists, they voted for him because that seemed to be consistent with their own preferences. Now, I would imagine Corwin could probably explain why perhaps a Reformed Christian would have voted for Nixon in that first election, and I would imagine it would have probably had very little to do with promises to get the United States out of Vietnam. I don't know, but you can imagine actually voting for the same candidate for two completely different reasons, and in some cases perhaps even somewhat opposite reasons, because as Corwin can explain much better than I, when you have two large sort of big tent parties that, in my opinion, have a somewhat strained relationship to their constituents, they have to bring into that tent a large number of quite different perspectives, preference orderings, views of the world, and so on, and try to build coalitions around that. And so you can imagine that in that coalition you would have voters with a variety of perspectives and preference orderings that aren't even all consistent with one another. But nevertheless, you might find yourself, as one of my professors in graduate school with a variety of allies on certain issues and not on others. So you will find, feminists and conservative Catholics perhaps joining up on certain issues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which makes for some interesting analysis with which Corwin is much better acquainted than I.
Yeah. Dr. Heilke, did you have any more questions or follow-up questions you wanted to ask for Dr. Smidt for him to respond to?
One of the things that pops into mind in that regard that I think is worth noting, and again, this is less of a concern than just an observation, is the business of just war. One of my professors in graduate school, again, used to say, I am a pacifist because I know what a jerk I am. He actually used a much stronger word, but we'll leave that off the air. And I've thought about that a lot. And then there is an element that's important for all Christians to recognize that, and all of us, and this is true of Anabaptists, of anybody, we're very good at deceiving ourselves, at excusing ourselves, at telling favorable stories about ourselves. And we're especially good at self-deceiving and self-justifying behavior when we're under stress or under threat. And this particular problem comes into, I think, fairly sharp focus when we talk about the problem of just war. There are many domestic issues we can talk about as well. But, Anabaptists, I think, have pointed out for a long time that in many ways being a pacifist is in pragmatic terms, much, much easier than being a Christian who is an advocate for just war, which is a long-standing doctrine that goes all the way back to Augustine and was more sharply described and I think philosophically perhaps a little more coherently described by Thomas Aquinas almost 1,000 years later, 800 years later. And Anabaptists have pointed out, people like John Howard Yoder have pointed out that it would be useful to think seriously about the just war doctrine and think seriously about how easily we implement that and how quickly we can implement that doctrine without really thinking through carefully what's entailed and what we're doing with that doctrine. And I won't go into all the details of that, so that's a whole other conversation. But there again, I think one of the things that we all in our various Christian traditions can do for one another is call upon one another to take aspects of that tradition more seriously than we often have. We've often, Christians, I think, have been too quick in a number of circumstances, and this isn't just in the American context, to assume that their side is right, to not really think through carefully what it is they are advocating for or what it is they are supporting. And one example of that in recent history then would be the second invasion of Iraq, where I had a number of Christian friends advocating for it on the basis of duty to protect. But then the way in which that war was prosecuted makes it pretty clear that duty was either forgotten or buried among other strategic concerns. And so to refer to that war as having really been a just war in either its initiation or its prosecution, I think would be a bit of a stretch. And there it's useful for these traditions to call upon one another in many circumstances to take their own their own doctrines, their own policies a little bit more seriously. And that's I think another useful aspect of the kind of conversation that I at least think Christians need to be having, not so much against one another, but with one another as we make our way through a world where it seems to me more and more we should be thinking ourselves not as people who might hold the reins of power, but as a people who live in exile.
Yeah. Dr. Smidt, did you have any thoughts in response to that?
No, I agree with Tom. I think both in terms of thinking about how our various traditions emphasize certain things, but at the neglect of others. And so, yes, the Reformed tradition is very much part of the just war tradition, but there are many biblical passages which really come to challenge, at least at the personal level, Christians about how they think about their enemies, and giving cloaks to your enemy, and ministering to your enemies, and so forth. That when we emphasize our distinctiveness and how we are different from each other, we fail to see the complexity of some of the things that we're challenged with, and the how the viewpoints of other Christians have been forged in different kinds of experiences and different kinds of contexts, and how each of us are shaped by that somewhat uniquely, and we need to learn from each other, because as we move forward, we will be confronting a different kind of world than what, as Christians, we've lived in the past. And so I think the notion of living in exile, the idea that the Anabaptists have something to offer from their experiences in that context, I think is a good point, and I have no disagreement with Tom in those matters.
Okay, I've got one other question for both of you. Could you both talk a little bit about the relationship between the Reformed tradition and the Anabaptist tradition in respect to natural law, and how that plays itself out and how we have Christians speak in the kind of the public sphere? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, the Reformed tradition is, I would say, views natural law as an ally type of thing. It's not so much opposed to natural law. Again, I'm speaking really as a novice from outside the philosophical perspective, but my understanding is that natural law would be viewed as something that could be used by Christians as a way of discussing political matters with those outside the Christian faith.
Okay.
Yeah, as I wrote in the chapter in this book, one of the handicaps, of course, that Anabaptists had was the severe persecution that they lived under for the first couple of generations led to a situation in which they never really developed. As a group, they never really developed a very, I don't know if the right word would be, sophisticated is probably not quite the word I'm looking for, but a very complex or let's use the word sophisticated for lack of a better word coming to mind, political theology or theology in general. I mean, they just didn't do theology, they did survival. And insofar as they had theological thinkers, it was always very much at the pragmatic level. So natural law really never shows up in the Anabaptist tradition. And then when there's finally an opportunity to articulate theology a little bit more closely, particularly in the 20th century, I would argue that Anabaptists, represented by people like Howard Bender, John Howard Yoder, and so on, really were pretty deeply suspicious and had some worthwhile critiques of natural law as giving anybody very much. What Anabaptists really depended on much more strongly was what they would refer to simply as the Gospels and the life of Jesus. And I think James K. Smith makes some worthwhile critiques of that particular approach in his chapter on the Reformed tradition. But in general, no, Anabaptists just wouldn't talk about natural law as a way of making sense of the world. And Corwin brings up a good point then. If that's the case, then what kind of language can we find that allows us to speak with our non-believing or non-Christian, at least, neighbor? And the argument is, well, first of all, you can use their moral language to hold them to account to their own standards, kind of in the way that Martin Luther King did in his arguments about constitutional freedoms and about the promise of the American polity, and that promise not being met in the case of African Americans. So there's some wonderful rhetorical usage there. So you use their own language, or you can, in some sense at least, appeal to parts of the language of the Gospels with respect to some of these social concerns. But the jury is out in both cases regarding how well that works. But in general, that would be one of those differences that theologians in both camps like to go after each other on a little bit. Natural law and how that functions when we're speaking to one another, particularly to non-believers.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Final concluding thoughts from both of you about the relationship between church and state.
It will be, I don't know if Corwin has any thoughts on this, but it will be interesting in the American context, I think, in the next 2 or 3 or 4 years, 5, 10 years, to see what happens with respect to that question of the relationship of Christians to political authority. But you see a very deep divide now between these two Christian camps with respect to how political authority in the United States should function in a number of different ways, and what it should be about. And I'm very curious, is again too light a word, but I'm very curious to see how that unfolds in the next 5 to 10 years.
I think if I were to assess the situation right now, of course, many things can happen between now and November, but it's going to be an issue that is going to be confronting both our churches and our political system for the next decade or two, and I don't see personally, I don't see it as a likely to be a time in which Christians will come together, but probably even greater divisions will continue, which I would lament, but it's probably going to be the situation.
Well, thank you both for talking with me. I appreciate it.